By now, most people are at least beginning to understand that we have a serious problem with climate change. For a long time now, we've been being warned by climate scientists and other influential people that we need to take action to stop carbon dioxide going over 350 parts per million in the atmosphere. That was considered by the scientific establishment to be the tipping point, the point of no return. Last year, it topped 400 parts per million. So where are we at now? While scientists and politicians and the United Nations just toss the hot potato around and end up doing very little of any significance, there are a few lone voices who look hard at reality and know that we are now on a collision course with our destiny, the destiny we've created for ourselves and all the other living beings on this planet. One of those is Guy McPherson, Professor Emeritus of Natural Resources and Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Arizona. Not that he teaches there these days. Professor McPherson is not welcome at the University of Arizona, as long as he keeps saying that economic growth is killing the planet and will kill us too, and that our industrial civilization is driving most living creatures, including ourselves, to extinction. But this scientist and teacher has a message for anyone who cares to hear it, and the facts to back it up. Very simply, the message is, we're now way past the point of no return, and it's time to consider what to do and how to live our lives when we understand that we're over the tipping point and heading ever more rapidly toward mass extinction. Guy McPherson talks to groups large and small around the country, including school groups. So our conversation began with the facts about climate change, and we went on to talk about what he tells people, especially young people, about what's happening to our planet and how they can relate to that. So, what's the reality of our situation? What's likely to be transpiring over the next, say, 30 years? Bearing in mind, of course, that things are already happening sooner and more drastically than most scientists have predicted.
Well, right. And so it requires that I play George Orwell and predict the future. Except that now it's, 70 years after he predicted the future. I don't think we have 70 years. So I suppose, doing what Orwell did, which is just to describe contemporary events and project them into the future as getting worse. What Huxley and Orwell and Ray Bradbury, that's what they all said they did, is just describe what's going on around them now that most people can't see. And so I foresee more nuclear power plants going Fukushima because we're in the age of net energy decline. So we don't have the cheap oil, cheap fossil fuels generally, that we had 10 years ago, that we could marshal at our command and ensure economic growth and plenty of fossil fuels to deal with problems when they arise, like Fukushima, or to ward off those problems, like we're seeing at Fort Calhoun nuclear power plant on the Missouri River. And it's been in the news again within the last 2 days after it almost melted down a year and a half ago because the river rose. So I see a continued nexus between climate change, human catastrophe, and I'm thinking of nuclear as a human catastrophe, and environmental decay. So climate change means that rivers fluctuate. The Missouri River rises. It gets to the point that it threatens a nuclear power plant. All the nuclear power plants are built right next to huge bodies of water because they need the water for the cooling ponds. So that's a prescription for disaster. I see continued extinction of species. I see continued fluctuations in weather like we're seeing with the jet stream, so that it gets really, really cold. Colder in Winnipeg than it is on Mars. Think about that for a minute. There's no humans on Mars. So obviously, if it's colder in Winnipeg than it is on Mars, and the power goes out in Winnipeg for a week or a month because of net energy decline, that's a whole bunch of dead people right there. Sub-Saharan Africa, those islands in the Pacific, it'll keep going and going and going. And at some point here in the southwestern interior of a large continent in the northern hemisphere, it's going to be dry and it's going to be windy. And we're going to be in the dust bowl that never ends, and everybody we know chokes to death on dust. At some point, we don't have the ability to escape that. And so it's going to be, it depends on where you live, what the challenges are going to be for human life. It might be the dust bowl that never ends. It might be wet bulb temperatures that are 95 degrees if you live near the coast, if you live in tropical areas. It might be that you run out of water. It might be any number of factors. It might be that it gets too cold for an extended period of time. It might be that it's too hot for an extended period of time, like it did in France. What was it, 2003, 2004, when tens of thousands of people died because it was just too hot. And imagine the interaction with power going out on an increasingly regular basis, interacting with environmental decay so that we're losing species and losing habitat for species, and then add on human catastrophe from, for example, nuclear power plants and power failures more generally, and dams that fail, and so people downriver are at risk, and all that adds up to me to an accelerating series of events like the ones we've had in the recent past, but getting worse every year.
So you talk about 3 paths to near-term extinction. Just spell out what those 3 paths are.
So the 3 paths to near-term extinction that I sometimes speak about are nuclear Armageddon, by which we allow those things to melt down catastrophically. Climate change, and it looks like it's a lot nearer now than it looked like 2 years ago. And the third is environmental decay. For example, the bees are all dying. We're in colony collapse disorder throughout the world, and including in North America. So Albert Einstein pointed out quite a few years ago, if we lose the bees, within 4 years we lose the humans. And so bees are just one harbinger of the ecological degradation that is well underway. And we're dumping all the soil into the oceans. We're contaminating the air, fouling the water. The list just goes on and on. 200 species a day, 150 to 200 species a day being driven to extinction. At some point, one of those species is us. How could it not be?
Taking the first of those 3, which is nuclear meltdown, that's not something that most people think of as a major factor that's driving a 6th mass extinction of species.
Well, it takes somewhere between a decade and 6 decades to safely decommission a nuclear power plant. In fact, there was a panel that met that included Ralph Nader and the most recent ex-head of the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United States. This is in New York City. This is maybe about 2 months ago. A friend of mine is a filmmaker, and she shot film and asked the final question. She said, Indian Point is the nearest nuclear power plant to here in New York City. How long would it take to decommission that safely so that it no longer represents a threat to the people in New York City? And they hemmed and hawed and went back and forth and talked to each other and tried to not answer the question. She kept pressing them for it. And finally they said, 6 decades. We start right now. 6 decades. That's one of the world's 440-some nuclear power plants. And at most of those nuclear power plants, there's more than one reactor. In Fukushima, there's 6, 4 of which apparently have melted down already. And so what that suggests to me is that we need to safely shut down all the nuclear power plants in the world. We need to start decommissioning them right now. I can't imagine we have 6 decades in which to shut them down, but that seems like it would be a reasonable goal, is to pour a bunch of resources into doing that. And if civilization doesn't collapse and we have enough time to shut down those nuclear power plants, then we ensure human extinction as a result of climate change. If civilization shuts down and therefore we somehow manage to extend our run as a species because of climate change, then all those nuclear power plants melt down catastrophically without proper timing to get them safely shut down.
And if we bring a halt to our industrial civilization, which would be a way of slowing climate change and the degradation of the planet, then that stops us from shutting down the power plants because
that would industrial civilization is necessary to shut down the nuclear power plants. We need to have all this.
Right, all the technology and all of the
right. We need to have the monetary system. We need to be able to pay people to shut those nuclear power plants down. We need to be able to transport materials and get them off the grid and do all those thousands of details of the hundreds of nuclear power plants. And so that requires that we maintain this set of living arrangements. And if we do, we're done. If we don't, we're done. So one of the things I like to say is if you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, then do. Do something. Because as Edward Abbey points out, action is the antidote to despair. So let's do something, even if it's hopeless, and especially if it's hopeless.
You don't have a lot of confidence in people like Bill McKibben and James Hansen, who's one of the world's leading climate scientists. Why are you so down on them?
He's promoting false hope. He goes around telling people they need to reduce their carbon footprint. Well, he flies around from event to event and tells people that if we just don't burn this amount of fossil fuels, we'll all be fine. If we get down to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we'll be fine. And we can do that by the middle of this century. That's a lie. That's an absolute lie, as evidenced by abundant science. Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences had a paper in February 2009, nearly 5 years ago, in which they pointed out that the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere today is the minimum level that we will see for at least the next 1,000 years. There is no way to suck carbon out of the atmosphere as rapidly as Bill McKibben says there is. There is no known way to do that. Now, never mind that 350 is a death sentence for a whole bunch of people. Island nations in the Pacific, for example, they're doomed at 350 parts per million. But he keeps going. I think he and James Hansen both are doing malpractice. They're the medical doctors who know the diagnosis and won't reveal it to the patient.
What about some of the very influential people like Al Gore, who's been leading the charge internationally to save the world from climate change?
Al Gore was onto the facts and was willing to reveal the facts before the situation became so dire. And I really appreciate him for that. And he had a position of influence and a lot of money, and he still didn't move the needle 1 degree. And so he is frequently pointed out to me as the example why wealthy people won't try to move the needle themselves. So I have people contact me and they say, I have this super rich friend and we're going to have lunch tomorrow and I'm going to tell him about your work and do you mind if we call you and have a conversation? I say, no, that'd be fine. And then they sit down and their super rich friend listens to their spiel, and the super rich friend says, no, Al Gore had all the money and a position of influence and he didn't move the needle 1 degree. There's no way. It's too late. I'm not going to get on board with that. Steve Wozniak contacted me a little over a year ago. He contacts me, says, you got it figured out on the climate front. I reached the same conclusion, so I'm moving to the southern hemisphere. But first I'd like to visit the mud hut and sort of duplicate what you've done there somewhere in southern Australia. Can we connect sometime? But you never see him talking about it. He gives interviews almost every day, and he never talks about climate change in those interviews. He talks about how the latest startup company can make money with their apps. So he knows.
When you talk about near-term extinction, do you mean total extinction, or can you imagine pockets of humans surviving in various places and life getting back to the way it was, something like that, within a few thousand years?
No, I mean the whole thing. Because we need habitat. And we've never had humans on a planet that was 3.5 degrees centigrade above baseline. We're now at 0.85 degrees above baseline. And we've triggered 30 self-reinforcing feedback loops already on the climate change front. So each of those speeds the process of warming of the planet. The most recent projections I've seen indicate that we're headed for in excess of 4 degrees C by 2030. A couple of problems there, mostly dealing with our food supply. We've already lost 40 or 50%, I can't remember the number, of the phytoplankton in the ocean since 1970 because of ocean acidification, and the ocean is becoming increasingly acidified. I suspect somewhere between 2 degrees C and 3 degrees C, we lose all the phytoplankton, or essentially all the phytoplankton. Well, that's the base of the marine food chain. Without phytoplankton, we aren't going to eat anything out of the ocean. Could be because of Fukushima, we maybe shouldn't be eating anything out of the Pacific Ocean already, but leave that aside for a moment. There will be nothing to eat that comes from the ocean. Also, the temperature swings associated with climate change, such as we're seeing now, the meandering jet stream making it cold in places that didn't used to get cold. Two winters ago, it was Mexico City that lost essentially the entire vegetable crop, all the way down to Mexico City. Well, that's a lot of winter vegetables for Americans. And 2 of the last 4 winters, Tucson has experienced cold winter temperatures that have killed 80 to 100-year-old citrus trees. That's cold. That's cold like hasn't been experienced in 80 to 100 years, 2 of the last 4 years. And so it's those temperature swings. It's not just a warming per se. It's the temperature swings associated with climatic warming that is going to kill all of our food that we grow on land, or essentially all. So there we have no food growing in the ocean, no food growing on the land. That's going to be problematic.
When the dinosaurs went extinct in the Fifth Great Extinction, which was 65 million years ago, we lost about 75% of all living beings, and the Permian extinction knocked out about 90% of them, I believe. How do you see this one, the Sixth Great Extinction, playing out for all our fellow animals? There are some biologists who say that after a major extinction, it takes about 10 million years for the planet to be thriving again.
Right, that's E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist. And yes, it could be that only 10 million years after the Sixth Great Extinction, the one that's underway, we will have a thriving green planet again. Maybe. Or it could be that we're going Venus this time. The latest analysis I've seen on the methane front indicates that we will have an atmosphere at a temperature similar to Venus by 2096, and it goes up from there. It wouldn't surprise me if we've triggered an extinction event that will exceed all previous extinction events on Earth. Obviously, I'm not working toward that. I'm working to try to avoid that, and that's why I think dismantling industrial civilization is fundamental at this point. About a month ago, scientists discovered some sort of slime mold in the sarcophagus at Chernobyl. Think about that for a minute. There's a species of life that can handle the kind of radiation levels within the sarcophagus. So clearly we can't kill everything despite our best efforts, even by having every nuclear power plant in the world melt down catastrophically. So that gives some room for optimism about life returning at a grand scale, if we don't go Venus with the atmosphere.
We humans spend much of our lives denying our own mortality and figuring out ways to enable ourselves to live on even when we're dead. How does this play into our inability to see the entire extinction of life itself that's facing us?
Derek Jensen writes, this culture and most of its members are insane. And that resonates with me. And one manifestation of our insanity is that we'll do anything to deny our own mortality. We've all known since we were 10 or 12 years old that we're going to die, that our mortality was insured. But we have this death-denying culture and infused with religion that convinces us otherwise. And so we have an entire culture that does that, and it's everything. It's every television show. It's the nightly news. It's the politicians and every lie that comes out of their mouths. It's every single thing having to do with this culture denies death in one form or another. And one of those ways is failing to recognize that we can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. We can, of course we can. Of course we can have 12 billion people occupy this planet, and the rising tide floats all boats, so all those people can be rich. And on the lies go. None of it makes any sense.
So what do you tell people they can do in the face of what is at best a rather scary and grim situation?
You can identify what you love and pursue that. And so I get that question all the time, obviously, especially from people we would consider relatively young, or at least I would consider relatively young. So college students come up after I'm done speaking, and they say something like, "So what should I do?" And I say, "What do you love?" And they look at me shocked because nobody's ever asked them that question before. They're 25 years old or 22 years old. Never have they been asked that question before. And so they say something like, "Well, I love to play music." And I say, "Well, why don't you do that?" And they say, "Well, because my parents are paying for my college and they don't really see that as a viable enterprise." I say, "Well, okay. So maybe you can negotiate, but I don't think you should give up what you love just because your parents think you need to have a career in finance or whatever." So, I mean, you're going to have to work that out, obviously, all by yourself between you and your parents. And maybe it involves you not going to college on their dime. Maybe it involves you going to college on their dime and pursuing a career while in your spare time doing the things you love. I don't know what that really means, but I would encourage you to identify what it is that you actually love to do and then try to make that happen. I guess I'm just trying to encourage people to pursue a life of excellence, given that our days are numbered and that they always have been. Since birth, we don't have a long time on this planet. So let's act as if moments matter. Let's pursue a life of excellence, not in the whiskey drinking, dope smoking, sort of hedonistic fashion, but in the manner of connecting with people on the planet in a way that's meaningful, so that our last memories, however many or few they might be, will be of connection with other people and with the living planet.
You also talk to young people at high schools, even middle schools. Do you talk to them about extinction, or how do you introduce them to all of this?
For students who are younger than college age, I try to just ask them questions. Or I do a 10-minute presentation, a little overview that doesn't get too deep into the climate change literature, and then just start posing questions to them. And what I want them to do, what I want everybody to do, coming away from a presentation of mine, is to keep asking questions. To stop believing everything they're told on the television. To stop believing everything that a politician tells them. And just dig a little deeper. I frequently get, "Well, what if you're wrong? What if everything you say is wrong?" And I think the more appropriate question should be, what if everything I say is right? What if we actually do have a finite number of days on this planet? What if we can't have economic growth forever? What does that mean for you as an individual? How does that influence how you live your life? Are you happy being a corporate drone in an office surrounded by computer screens and pushing digits around to make fiat currency? Is that your version of a joyous way to live? And for some people it is. I've no doubt that there are people out there who are driven to make money, to apply an analytical mind to the process of moving money around, especially other people's money, to further enrich themselves. There will always be those kinds of people, but do the rest of us have to work for them? Do the rest of us have to spend our days making their days better? So these are the kinds of questions and kind of issues I'd like to get into. And they apply to everybody. It's not as if there's a 10-year-old out there who shouldn't be asking questions about the system in which they're embedded, about the civilization that they have never questioned, that their parents have never questioned, that their grandparents have never questioned. I don't think it's ever too early to start asking questions like, how should I spend my day? And how should I spend my life? And what should I do today that will make the world a better place for humans and other animals?